There is a specific reason you're here right now listening to this, and it has very little to do with curiosity or self-improvement. Something in you already knows that the way you've been trying to solve your life isn't working in proportion to the effort you're putting in, not because you're incapable, not because you're unfocused, and not because you lack discipline, but because at a certain point, effort stops being the missing ingredient. And when that point is reached, continuing to push in the same way doesn't move you forward. It actually obscures what would. You may not have language for this yet, but you've likely felt it. Moments where you did everything right and nothing shifted. Periods where you applied intelligence, strategy, reflection, even growth, and still found yourself circling the same financial pressures, the same relational patterns, the same internal friction. And somewhere beneath the frustration, there's a quieter recognition forming that says, this shouldn't feel this hard anymore. That recognition is not resignation. It's perception beginning to recalibrate. What most people don't realize is that reality doesn't only respond to action, it responds to signal. And long before outcomes appear as events, they exist as information moving through a field your nervous system is either able to receive or unable to detect. This isn't philosophy, it's how orientation works. You don't navigate the world directly, you navigate what your system is able to register. And when that registration is distorted, life feels like constant resistance. Even when you're capable and trying, there is a frequency, for lack of a better word, that carries solution before it carries struggle. It doesn't arrive as answers or instructions, it arrives as coherence, as timing that suddenly makes sense, as options you couldn't see 5 minutes earlier, as a felt sense that something aligns without needing to be forced. This frequency is not rare. It isn't reserved for certain people. It has been available for your entire life, regardless of your circumstances, intelligence, trauma, or background. And it's available now. The only difference between those who seem to live in flow and those who live in effort is not access. It's reception. This is where most explanations go wrong, because they assume the problem is something missing, more knowledge, better habits, deeper healing, stronger mindset. But what if the primary issue isn't absence, but interference? What if the thing preventing resolution isn't lack of effort, but a constant internal signal that drowns out the information that would make most of your struggle unnecessary? And what if that signal feels exactly like being responsible, thoughtful, and in control? You've been taught, explicitly and implicitly, that thinking harder is the same as progressing, that analyzing a situation thoroughly is the safest way forward, that staying mentally engaged with problems is how you prevent things from getting worse. And in many narrow, mechanical contexts, that's true. But when this mode becomes constant, when it never turns off, it doesn't just help you solve problems, it determines which layer of reality you're allowed to perceive. And most people are locked into a layer that shows effort, friction, and delay, while completely filtering out the layer where alignment precedes action. If you've ever wondered why some people seem to encounter solutions before problems fully form, why opportunities appear for them without visible strain, or why their lives reorganize with far less force than yours despite comparable effort, this is not coincidence, it's not luck, and it's not superiority. It's a nervous system operating in a receptive state rather than a jamming one. They are not doing more, they are interfering less. This may already feel familiar in a way that's difficult to articulate. You might recognize brief moments in your own life where everything suddenly felt clear, where the right conversation happened at the right time, where a decision resolved itself without deliberation, where something moved smoothly without explanation. Those moments weren't anomalies. They were glimpses of what happens when the signal comes through without obstruction. And the fact that you've experienced them at all is important because it means your system knows this state. It's not something you have to learn, it's something you've lost consistent access to. What makes this difficult to see is that the very mechanism blocking reception presents itself as intelligence. It sounds like planning, it feels like responsibility, it justifies itself as caution, and because it has helped you survive, you trust it. But survival-oriented perception is not the same as solution-oriented perception. One narrows the field to avoid threat. The other widens it to reveal possibility. And you cannot run both at full volume at the same time. This is why so many people reach a point where conventional problem-solving stops working. Not because they've failed, but because they've outgrown the level of perception they're using. Their lives require a different signal, but their nervous system is still tuned to constant control, constant analysis, constant future management. The result is exhaustion without resolution, movement without traction, effort without return. What we're exploring here isn't a belief system or a technique. It's a recognition of how reception actually works, of how your system filters reality before you ever make a decision. And once you see this, the question stops being, how do I fix my life, and becomes, what am I preventing myself from receiving? Because the moment that interference quiets even slightly, the nature of your problems begins to change. And this is only the beginning. To understand why reception matters more than effort, you first have to understand what your nervous system is actually doing throughout the day. It is not merely responding to events as they happen. Long before anything reaches conscious thought, your system is selecting, filtering, and prioritizing information based on what it believes is relevant for survival and orientation. What you experience as reality is already a curated stream, shaped by thresholds you didn't consciously choose, but that were trained into you over time. Your nervous system is designed to reduce complexity. It cannot process everything available in the environment, so it learns to narrow. This narrowing is useful when danger is present, when quick decisions are required, when predictability keeps you safe. Over time, however, this narrowing becomes habitual. It continues even when threat is no longer immediate. And when it does, your perception becomes optimized for managing risk rather than detecting opportunity. You remain capable, intelligent, and functional, but you are no longer receptive in the way that allows alignment to emerge naturally. What matters here is not the events themselves, but the state from which you meet them. Two people can encounter the same circumstances and experience completely different outcomes, not because one is luckier, but because one system is open enough to register subtle cues while the other is occupied with managing internal noise. The difference is not effort, it is bandwidth. And bandwidth is determined by how much of your system is consumed by internal monitoring, prediction, and control. When your nervous system is in a heightened state, even a subtle one, attention collapses inward. You begin scanning for what needs fixing, what could go wrong, what must be addressed next. This scanning becomes background activity. You may not even notice it, because it feels like thinking. But thinking, in this context, is not neutral. It carries a physiological signature. Muscles tighten slightly. Breath shortens imperceptibly. Awareness narrows, and as this happens, the system prioritizes known patterns over emerging information. This is where reception begins to degrade. Not because information disappears, but because the filters become too rigid to allow anything unexpected through. The nervous system becomes excellent at confirming what it already believes is relevant and increasingly blind to signals that do not match its existing map. This is why so many people feel stuck despite growth. Their internal map has become more sophisticated but not more flexible. They know more but they receive less. The solution frequency operates through a different mode of perception entirely. It does not announce itself loudly, it does not arrive with urgency or insistence. It comes through subtle shifts in orientation, a sense of ease around one option and friction around another, a feeling that a particular timing is right without being able to justify why. A quiet pull toward something that doesn't yet have form. These signals are not abstract. They are physiological. They are felt in the body before they are understood by the mind. For these signals to register, the nervous system must be in a state of relative openness, not passive, not disengaged, but uncompressed. This openness allows multiple layers of information to be held simultaneously without immediate categorization. It is the state in which intuition operates, not as mysticism, but as rapid pattern recognition beyond conscious sequencing. Your system knows more than your thoughts can articulate, but only when it is not occupied with constant management. Most people are rarely in this state, not because they are incapable of it, but because modern life trains the opposite orientation. Continuous stimulation, perpetual decision-making, and the pressure to optimize every moment keep the system in a mild but chronic state of contraction. You may not feel anxious, you may feel productive, but productivity and receptivity are not the same. One consumes signal, the other allows it. As this is why rest alone doesn't always restore clarity. You can stop working and still remain internally tense. You can take time off and continue replaying scenarios, planning conversations, anticipating outcomes. The body is still engaged in projection, still orienting toward future resolution. In that state, the nervous system remains busy even in stillness. And a busy system cannot receive. The people who seem to move through life with less friction are not free from challenge. Their systems are simply better calibrated to detect information early. They sense misalignment before it becomes crisis. They recognize opportunity before it becomes scarcity. They respond to signals when they are quiet, rather than waiting until they are loud. This gives the impression of ease, but what you are witnessing is timing rather than effort. You already know what this feels like. There have been moments when you didn't have to think your way forward, when something in you knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when the right choice felt obvious without debate. These moments were not random. They occurred when your nervous system briefly exited its habitual narrowing and allowed a broader field of information to register. The clarity you felt then was not added, it was revealed. What we call the solution frequency is simply the layer of information that becomes accessible when this broader reception is available. It is not separate from reality. It is reality experienced without excessive filtering. And because it contains more context, more pattern, and more relational data, it naturally reduces struggle. Not by eliminating effort, but by directing it with precision. When the nervous system receives clearly, action becomes simpler. Fewer options feel viable, not because you are limited, but because alignment is apparent. You are no longer choosing between 10 possibilities. You are responding to the one that makes sense. This is not indecision resolved through force. It is indecision dissolving through clarity. As this becomes familiar, a subtle shift occurs. You stop trying to stay ahead of life. You begin meeting it where it is. The urgency softens. The constant internal narration quiets. And in that quiet, information you didn't know you were missing begins to appear. Not as grand revelations, but as small, timely recognitions that change how you move. And yet this still leaves a critical question unanswered. If the nervous system is capable of this kind of reception, and if the information has always been available, why does it remain inaccessible for so long? Why do intelligent, reflective, capable people stay locked in interference even when effort clearly isn't working? The reason this remains inaccessible for so many people is not because the nervous system lacks capacity, but because a specific pattern has been reinforced until it feels like identity. The interference does not arrive as noise, it arrives as competence. It sounds like responsibility, it feels like staying ahead of life. And because it has protected you in the past, you trust it without question. Over time, this pattern becomes so familiar that you no longer recognize it as interference at all. You experience it as who you are. This pattern operates through continuous internal engagement. The mind stays slightly forward of the present moment, tracking what might be needed next, anticipating outcomes, evaluating options before they arise. This orientation feels intelligent because it is predictive. It reduces surprise, it gives the impression of control. But prediction requires narrowing. It privileges what is already known and devalues what has not yet appeared. In doing so, it filters out precisely the information that would allow alignment to emerge before force is required. Interference does not come from thinking itself. It comes from unbroken thinking, from the absence of space between perception and evaluation. When the system is never allowed to rest in direct contact with the present moment, it loses sensitivity. Everything must pass through interpretation first. Sensation becomes data, feeling becomes assessment, intuition becomes something to be explained rather than followed. The signal is still present, but it is consistently overridden before it can register. This is why interference is so difficult to interrupt. It feels necessary. It convinces you that if you stop managing, something will fall apart. The nervous system equates constant engagement with safety, even when the cost of that engagement is chronic friction. Over time, the body adapts to this state. Tension becomes normal, mental noise becomes background. The absence of clarity feels dangerous because clarity has become unfamiliar. What's rarely acknowledged is that this pattern was taught, not deliberately but culturally. You learned early that attention earns approval, that vigilance prevents mistakes, that planning equals maturity. You learned to stay mentally active even in moments that didn't require it. Over time, stillness became associated with laziness or avoidance, and receptivity was mistaken for passivity. The nervous system internalized this message long before you could question it. As this pattern consolidates, perception begins to lag behind reality. You respond to what has already happened rather than what is emerging. Opportunities appear and pass without being registered because they do not fit existing categories. Timing windows close because the system is too occupied with internal dialogue to notice subtle openings. Life begins to feel like a series of reactions rather than a field of participation. This is where struggle accumulates, not all at once, but gradually. Small misalignments compound. Decisions made from interference create additional complexity. Problems multiply not because reality is hostile, but because perception is delayed. The nervous system is always a step behind, trying to manage consequences instead of sensing direction. The interference pattern reinforces itself through results. When effort produces some outcome, even if it is inefficient, the system interprets this as proof that the pattern works. It ignores the cost. Exhaustion, anxiety, diminished creativity, strained relationships are treated as acceptable collateral. What matters is that something happened. The deeper question of whether it could have happened with less force never arises. Yet there are moments when this pattern briefly loosens. Often during transitions, after a loss, during travel, in states of absorption where the mind forgets itself. In these moments, perception widens, you notice more. Solutions appear without deliberation, connections form effortlessly, and just as quickly the system tightens again, reasserting control, dismissing what occurred as coincidence. What actually happened in those moments was not luck, it was reduced interference. The nervous system relaxed its grip just enough for additional information to come through. The contrast between these moments and the rest of life is often stark, which is why people describe them as special or rare. But they are only rare because the interference pattern is so consistently reinforced. The most subtle aspect of this pattern is that it positions the mind as the primary authority. Even when the body senses something is off, the mind insists on justification. Even when timing feels wrong, analysis pushes forward. Even when something wants to resolve naturally, effort interferes. This creates a quiet internal conflict where one part of you knows and another part insists on overriding that knowing. Over time, trust shifts entirely to cognition, and the body's signals are treated as secondary or unreliable. This is not a failure of intuition, it is a hierarchy problem. The system has been trained to privilege explanation over orientation, and explanation always arrives after the fact. Orientation happens in real time. When explanation leads, perception lags. When orientation leads, explanation follows naturally. The interference pattern reverses this order, placing explanation first and forcing orientation to comply. As long as this hierarchy remains intact, the solution frequency cannot fully register, not because it is blocked completely, but because it is consistently deprioritized. The system receives it and discards it before it reaches conscious awareness. This creates the experience of searching, of always looking for something that never quite arrives, of sensing that there is a simpler way but being unable to access it consistently. What makes this particularly challenging is that the interference pattern is rewarded. Society rewards busyness. Productivity is visible. Control looks competent. Receptivity looks ambiguous. And ambiguity feels risky to a system trained to avoid uncertainty. So the pattern continues, reinforced externally and internally, even as its effectiveness diminishes. And yet, there is a threshold, a point at which the cost becomes undeniable, when effort no longer compensates for misalignment, when solutions feel temporary, when complexity increases faster than capacity. Many people listening to this are already near or past that threshold, not because they have failed, but because their system is ready for a different mode of engagement. The recognition of interference is the first real shift, not fixing it, not overcoming it, simply seeing it as a pattern rather than an identity. The moment you recognize that what feels like you is actually a learned orientation, space opens, and in that space something else becomes possible. But recognition alone is not enough, because even once the interference pattern is seen, it still feels safer than the unknown state beyond it, which raises the next question: what actually happens when this pattern loosens? And why does that change the nature of problems so dramatically? Once the interference pattern begins to loosen, something unexpected happens. The problems you've been carrying don't immediately disappear, but they begin to feel different. Their weight changes, their urgency softens, and what once demanded constant attention starts to reorganize on its own. This is not because anything external has shifted yet, but because the point from which you are meeting reality has changed. And that change alters the role problems play in your life. Most of what you experience as struggle is not a collection of independent issues. It is a single pattern expressing itself through many domains: money, relationships, health, creativity, direction. They appear separate, but they are linked by the same underlying orientation. When perception is compressed, life becomes a sequence of obstacles. When perception widens, those same circumstances reveal themselves as signals, adjustments, and invitations to realign. The events don't vanish, their meaning does. This is where the inversion occurs. What you once treated as problems in need of solutions begin to reveal themselves as symptoms, not of personal deficiency, but of operating from a narrowed field of information. The struggle was never the primary issue, it was feedback. And once feedback is recognized for what it is, it no longer needs to escalate to be heard. The solution frequency does not arrive with answers. It arrives with context. It shows you what matters and what does not. It clarifies timing. It reveals when effort will compound and when it will dissipate. And with that clarity, an extraordinary thing happens. Many problems resolve themselves without direct intervention because they were only sustained by misalignment. When alignment returns, they have nothing to feed on. Consider how this plays out across different areas of life. Financial pressure often feels like a constant demand to do more, think harder, optimize further. But when reception is clear, value creation becomes visible. You sense where your energy actually belongs. You recognize opportunities that match your nature rather than forcing strategies that drain you. The struggle softens not because money appears out of nowhere, but because effort stops leaking into directions that were never viable. In relationships, difficulty often arises from persistence without coherence. Conversations are had repeatedly, insights are gained, patterns are discussed, and yet something remains off. When reception clears, compatibility becomes obvious. You sense when something is meant to deepen and when it is meant to conclude. Endings lose their drama because they are no longer resisted. Connections form more easily because availability replaces effort. The struggle dissolves not through fixing, but through recognition. With health, many people accumulate knowledge while remaining disconnected from their own signals. Protocols are followed, advice is layered, discipline increases. But the body remains tense, inflamed, or fatigued. When reception returns, the body's guidance becomes audible again. You sense what supports you and what depletes you. Rest is no longer negotiated. Movement becomes intuitive. Healing unfolds through responsiveness rather than enforcement. Creative blocks follow the same pattern. They are rarely about lack of talent or inspiration. They arise when expression is forced out of sequence, when output is demanded without listening, when timing is ignored. As reception clears, creativity returns not as effort but as inevitability. Ideas surface fully formed. Work feels guided rather than extracted. The block was never absence, it was interference. This is why the shift resolves so much at once, not because the frequency fixes everything, but because it removes the distortion that made everything feel like a problem. When perception realigns, the system stops generating unnecessary friction. What remains are tasks, choices, and actions that are appropriate to the moment. These require energy, but not struggle. They move forward without internal resistance. It's important to understand that this does not create a life without difficulty. Certain things still require effort. Physical tasks must be done. Commitments must be honored. Consequences still exist. But the nature of effort changes. It becomes proportionate. You stop expending energy on battles that were never meant to be won. You stop carrying questions that were never meant to be answered through force. Most of what you have been trying to solve was not asking for strategy. It was asking for orientation. Once orientation is restored, the majority of those issues either dissolve or simplify to the point where action is obvious. What remains is manageable, direct, and rarely overwhelming. This is also why people who experience this shift often struggle to explain it to others. From the outside, it looks like luck, or ease, or privilege, but internally it feels like relief, like no longer fighting the current. Like realizing you've been swimming upstream because you didn't know the river turned. You may already sense this change beginning, a quiet recognition that not everything deserves your attention, a softening of urgency around things that once consumed you, a growing trust that clarity does not require constant vigilance. These are not signs of disengagement, they are signs of coherence returning. As this coherence stabilizes, the nervous system stops bracing for impact. It no longer needs to anticipate every outcome. It learns to respond instead. This response is not passive, it is precise. And precision is what allows life to reorganize with far less force. What remains now is the most delicate part of this shift, because even when the change is felt, the old pattern does not disappear overnight. The urge to intervene, to manage, to analyze will still arise. And the way you meet that urge determines whether reception deepens or collapses back into interference. Integration is where this stops being an insight and becomes a way of moving through life. Not as a practice you remember to do, but as a baseline orientation that gradually replaces the old pattern. This stage is quieter than everything that came before it, which is why it's so often misunderstood. Nothing dramatic announces the shift. There is no single moment where everything changes. Instead, you begin to notice that you are no longer reacting in the same way, even when the circumstances look familiar. The first thing that changes is your relationship with urgency. Situations still arise, decisions still need to be made, but the internal pressure to resolve everything immediately begins to loosen. You find yourself pausing without effort. Not hesitating, not avoiding, but allowing a moment for orientation to settle before action. In that pause, something subtle becomes available. A sense of what actually matters now, rather than what feels loudest or most demanding. This is where the solution frequency becomes practical. It does not tell you what to do in words. It informs you through resonance. Certain options feel neutral. Others feel quietly coherent. You may not be able to justify why one path feels right and another feels off, but the distinction is clear enough that you don't need to argue with it. Action taken from this place feels clean. It doesn't fragment your energy, it doesn't create additional problems downstream. You begin to notice that fewer decisions are required, not because life is simpler, but because alignment reduces noise. When your system is receiving clearly, many options remove themselves. You are no longer choosing between 10 possibilities. You are responding to the one that fits. This response is efficient without being rushed. It conserves energy rather than consuming it. As this becomes familiar, effort reorganizes itself. You still work, you still engage, but the work is directed. You stop pushing where there is resistance and start moving where there is traction. This is not avoidance. Resistance still has information, but it is no longer something to overpower reflexively. You sense when resistance is a signal to pause, adjust, or wait, and when it is simply the friction of growth. The difference is felt rather than calculated. Relationships change in this phase in ways that are often surprising. You find yourself less inclined to explain, justify, or manage outcomes. Conversations become simpler. Boundaries emerge naturally rather than being enforced. You recognize compatibility without needing evidence. When something is no longer aligned, it becomes obvious early before resentment accumulates. Endings, when they occur, feel cleaner. Beginnings feel less anxious. There is less effort spent trying to make things work and more ease in allowing what works to deepen. Creativity follows the same rhythm. You stop trying to extract output from yourself. Ideas begin to arrive unannounced. Timing becomes clearer. You know when to act and when to wait. When you do act, the work moves quickly because it is already formed internally. The sense of blockage fades, replaced by a quieter trust that what needs to emerge will do so when conditions are right. You are no longer competing with yourself. Even the body responds to this shift. Without being instructed, it begins to regulate more efficiently. Tension releases where it is no longer needed. Rest becomes restorative rather than just an interruption. Movement feels guided. Appetite, focus, and energy find a more natural rhythm. This does not replace medical care or practical responsibility, but it changes the quality of your participation in your own well-being. You listen earlier, you adjust sooner, you stop overriding signals until they escalate. One of the most important aspects of integration is restraint. Not suppression, but the ability to refrain from unnecessary intervention. You notice the impulse to analyze, to plan ahead, to solve prematurely, and instead of following it automatically, you allow it to pass. This is not discipline, it is recognition. You can feel when interference is trying to reassert itself, and you no longer confuse that impulse with intelligence. This restraint creates space, and in that space, timing becomes your ally. You act when something is ripe instead of forcing it to ripen. You speak when words will land instead of rehearsing them endlessly. You move when momentum is present rather than trying to manufacture it. Over time, this builds trust, not as a belief but as lived evidence that less interference produces better outcomes. It's important to say this clearly. Integration does not mean disengagement. You are not stepping back from life. You are stepping into it with a different posture, one that is responsive rather than controlling, one that allows information to arrive before decisions are made, one that treats clarity as a prerequisite rather than a luxury. As this posture stabilizes, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel supported by life rather than opposed by it, not because circumstances are always favorable, but because you are no longer misaligned with what is unfolding. You meet situations as they are with the right amount of energy at the right time. Struggle decreases not because challenges vanish, but because you are no longer fighting the current. By this point, you may recognize that the solution frequency was never something to be activated. It was something to be stopped from being blocked. Integration is simply the gradual removal of habits that drown out signal. And as those habits fall away, what remains feels strangely familiar, like returning to a way of moving you once knew before effort became synonymous with survival. All that remains now is to close the loop, to return to where this began, not with explanation, but with recognition. If you listen closely, you can feel how different this moment is from when you began. Nothing dramatic has happened on the surface. Your life has not been rearranged in the last hour, and yet something has settled. The urgency that was quietly running in the background has softened. The need to immediately apply, fix, or resolve what you've heard has loosened its grip. This is not because you've disengaged, but because something more fundamental has come back online. What you are sensing now is not an idea landing. It is orientation returning. The solution frequency was never something you had to activate, earn, or cultivate. It was never withheld from you, and it was never lost. It has been present through every phase of your life, broadcasting continuously beneath the surface of events. The only thing that changed over time was your system's capacity to receive it without interference, and the interference was never malicious. It was adaptive. It helped you survive. It helped you function. It helped you belong. But at a certain point, what once protected you began to constrain you. You can feel the difference now because your nervous system recognizes coherence when it encounters it. This recognition does not arrive as certainty. It arrives as relief, as the quiet sense that you no longer need to chase clarity because clarity is not something you manufacture. It is something you allow. And allowance begins when you stop drowning out signal with constant internal motion. This is why the shift feels subtle rather than explosive. The most profound changes rarely announce themselves. They register as a return to something simple and obvious that somehow became inaccessible over time. You are not becoming someone new. You are releasing an orientation that is no longer necessary. And in doing so, you are restoring access to a layer of perception that has always been yours. From here, life will not become perfect. That was never the promise. What changes is the ratio between effort and outcome. You will still act, but action will be informed rather than reactive. You will still face challenges, but they will arrive with context rather than confusion. You will still make decisions, but far fewer of them will feel heavy or uncertain. Struggle diminishes not because difficulty disappears, but because misalignment no longer compounds it. You may notice this first in small ways, a decision that resolves itself without debate, a conversation that lands without rehearsal, a sense of timing that feels quietly accurate. These are not coincidences, they are indicators that reception is clearing, that the system is no longer filtering out what it doesn't already understand, that you are allowing information to reach you before force is required. As this stabilizes, trust builds naturally, not blind trust, empirical trust, the kind that forms when you see, repeatedly, that less interference produces better outcomes. That clarity arrives faster when you stop chasing it. That life responds differently when you are no longer trying to stay ahead of it. Over time, this trust replaces the need for constant management. You stop gripping the wheel so tightly because the road is visible again. This is the return, not to a belief, not to a method, but to a way of being in contact with reality that does not require perpetual effort. You are still engaged, still responsible, still discerning, but you are no longer operating from compression. You are responding from coherence, and this is where we pause. Before we close, there is a moment here that matters, because the version of you who has stayed with this until now is not the same as the one who began listening. Something has shifted internally, even if you can't yet name it. A quiet recognition, a loosening, a sense that you no longer need to solve everything from the same place. If this resonates, if you can feel that something has reorganized even slightly, you're invited to write a short declaration in the comments. Write this to anchor the shift. I receive what has always been available to me. Only write it if it feels true, not because it sounds good, but because your system recognizes it. And if it does, let that be enough. Now return with me to where we began. The frequency you've been searching for was never hidden. The solutions you thought you lacked were never missing. The flow you believed belonged to others was never exclusive. It has been here the entire time.